So hello everyone, we are on to the second of our vlogs this week, and so the first vlog was a bit of a learning experience for me, and I very happy to, I suppose, to step into this space to have longer conversations about things that I think are of real value. A lot of the stuff that I do on social media, I feel it just gets to the very surface of certain topics, and it's not that I don't get asked lots of times about, whether it be CBD oil or intermittent fasting, but I just don't feel like it's the platform for going into those topics in any kind of detail. So I'm very fortunate to have friends, colleagues, and people like that in my network that I can invite on to have a chat like this. And today we are talking to Brendan Egan, a very good friend of mine, and someone who I've played sport with and worked with. Brendan has done a lot of work even in shaping the direction of my career, and we've had a lot of conversations down through the years on the topics of nutrition. So first of all, I'd like Brendan to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about what he does.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. Brendan Egan is my name. I'm an associate professor of sport and exercise physiology at DCU here in Ireland, and I have a research group that looks at projects around exercise and nutrition interventions. We are generally interested in performance across the life course, so that's everything from athletes to older adults. And yeah, my lecturing topics are exercise physiology and sports nutrition. And I suppose, I practice as a sports nutritionist as well. That's 1 foot in the academic side and 1 foot in practice. So, me.
And you've obviously played sport to a very high level yourself. Decorated career?
Well, that's a matter of interpretation. Yeah, I played intercounty football for I was 14 years, so still hanging in there.
And St. Vincent's, of course, too.
I haven't retired, so hanging in there.
I mean, we just briefly, we have talked an awful lot over the years about our experience of playing sport and the value that can bring to applying certain areas of nutrition to what we experience ourselves, and how valuable that can be in communicating with people and athletes.
Yeah, I mean, I agree fully. So the one element of it is that you can read scientific papers, or you can read blogs, or listen to opinions, and there's some people talking about things that should be put into practice. And if you're an athlete yourself, you can self-experiment and learn a lot about whether you think these things would work or not. And on the flip side of that, as a practitioner, having been through the experience of trying out these things on yourself, you can empathize or give your experiences to the athletes that you're dealing with. So yeah, it's definitely a benefit, I think, to have played sport and have tried out these things, and then pass on your practices and thoughts to the athletes and clients.
I think it's a great position to be in, to be working in the academic world and seeing, to use your own words, to be at the coal face and see what's emerging from science, and then to be able to first look at it from your own perspective and see is something practical, and then to be able to have a very well-rounded conversation with an athlete.
Yeah, and there are lots of things that are published as positive findings that you could argue are, maybe the research design and the statistics don't support it being a positive finding. That's one element. And there are other findings that are just maybe impractical to apply in an athletic context. So yeah, again, you have to kind of filter everything through that lens as well when dealing with clients, athletes.
So today, what I'm hoping we'll have lots of conversations, but today I want to talk to you about intermittent fasting. And intermittent fasting is something that comes up a lot in questions from both athletes and the general population. And obviously it's an area of research as well that's emerged over the past, I'd say it's probably more so in the last 5 years that we're starting to see papers come out. There could be research back from 10, 20 years ago that you could be able to, that you could reference, but I think it's only come online or come on I'm going to use the word trend in more recent years. What is intermittent fasting?
Yeah, well, actually, it's interesting that you mentioned about it probably is the last 5 years where there's been a lot more human studies. But it's funny, you and I, again, speaking about down the years, we've always kind of had this idea that there should be some kind of structure in the way that people eat. And I think we had normally, we'd settled on this idea of 12 hours of eating and 12 hours of fasting on a given day. And intermittent fasting really just extends that a little bit further. It's, in the classic way of doing it, it's a 16-hour fast and an 8-hour feeding window each day. And the choice of when that window occurs is usually up to the individual, but I'll say a little bit about some research that's done on the time of that window shortly. But the broader terminology of fast and intermittent fasting could probably be extended out to, this idea of the alternate day fasting, which is basically 1 day of eating, 1 day of not eating, on and off. There's periodic fasting where it's, extended fasting where it might be 2, 3, up to 7 days of fasting some individuals will do. And then there's other things that get put into the time restricted eating or fasting idea, which are things like fasting mimicking diets, or something like the 5-2 diet. But in both of those latter two, people are eating calories at times. 5-2 diet is simply eat 5 days normally and then 2 days of restriction. To me, that's just calorie restriction. That's not what I would call time restricted eating, like we think of it from a research point of view. So, like I say, the traditional, or the kind of, a lot of the way people think about it now is this kind of 16-8 idea, but it's been done as short as 4 hours of feeding, up to 10 hours of feeding, and also called intermittent fasting or time restricted eating. So, and I just say I'm switching back and forth between the word eating and feeding. Again, feeding tends to refer to animal studies, and eating tends to refer to human studies, but that's not universally accepted. But that's kind of the way that I try and think about it as well.
So one of the things, like we've had great conversations down through the years, and it's probably been the most valuable, certainly from my perspective, and how I've learned has been the opportunity to talk to you about topics that emerge in science, but take time to understand. And I've made plenty of mistakes within practice, but first of all, we would be able to have a conversation around the topic and then figure out what the mistake was, or our interpretation or implementation. One of the things that we both came up with as such a key element within nutrition and lifestyle was context, and understanding things in context. So I suppose one of the things about intermittent fasting is that it is so contextual. It's so important to understand it in the context of a person's goal or lifestyle. And is it fair to say that intermittent fasting has emerged from a research perspective from overweight and obesity studies? Or maybe you can kind of shine some light on that.
Yeah, there's probably two very closely related arms, I would say. There's this, and we're kind of talking about theory into practice here. So on one hand, there's definitely a lot of interest in the idea of circadian rhythms, the biological rhythms that are within the body that are dictated by light and dark cycles. And there are certain elements of metabolism that are influenced in that way, and that in turn affects how our body handles the nutrients that we eat. So there is certainly a line of work that would say that we should eat in a manner that complements our circadian biology. And so if you were to extend that to how that works in practice, that's basically an example of time restricted eating. There are certain windows, most early in the day usually, where our body handles nutrients better than it does later in the day. So that's one element. And then the other is just the observational studies that would show that in most developed countries, the eating window is it's probably 14, 15, 16 hours on average, and that we eat a lot of calories just by virtue of the fact of having such a long feeding window. And if you narrow that window, simply by virtue of narrowing the window, you reduce the amount of calories that are eaten in a day, and that in its own right can bring about benefits to weight loss. And then I suppose more recently, the research has now moved to the idea of kind of merging the two ideas. So as I said earlier, this 8-hour eating window can now be considered to be an early or a late window. So if you have an early dinner, so you basically start your eating window at breakfast and have an early dinner, that's called early time restricted eating. And if you skip breakfast, or let's say delay breakfast, because ultimately whatever you eat first is your breakfast, but if you delay your breakfast and you eat a late evening meal, but still only eat for 8 hours, that's called late time restricted eating. And so those are kind of the ways I think of this. But the interesting thing that's really come out in the last couple of years is that independent of weight loss, there does seem to be benefits of time restricted eating. And that's probably, the hot topic at the moment, is that even when people are not restricting calories and they're not eating any less than they normally would, and they're not really changing their diet in terms of the food that they eat, there are some benefits that seem to be accrued at the level of insulin sensitivity, metabolic health, blood pressure, and so on. And so, that's definitely the hottest topic, I think, at the moment from the health side of things. And obviously, we can talk about the performance side of things as well later, I'm sure.
Yeah, I might come back to you about those benefits that you mentioned in a little bit. But I think that there's some confusion as well, particularly around the area of the benefits that intermittent fasting can bring, but also in the context of the of energy metabolism and what's actually happening during intermittent fasting, and an increase in fat metabolism, and that being confused maybe with fat loss. So could you just give a little bit again of the differentiating elements to that?
Yeah. Okay, so if a lot, as you say, and we both agree, the more recent research in humans has only been the past 5 years, whereas there's probably 20 years of research in animal models. And the first thing to say about these rodent models, mice or rats, is that they have a different metabolism than humans. Their metabolism is generally faster. The number that's often used is that mice have 7 times faster metabolism than humans. So their response to intermittent fasting is that they rapidly go in to the fasted state. They increase markers of fasting, so things like beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is ketone body. They also increase markers of autophagy in muscle and in liver very much more rapidly than we do in humans. And they, for want of a better phrase, they burn a lot more fat at rest under conditions of fasting than humans do. And again, just to illustrate the point, a mouse can lose about 20% of its body mass after 24 or 48 hours of fasting, whereas a human will lose 1% or 2% at the absolute most, and that would, some of that will be water loss as well. So the difference, translating what's been done in rodent models into humans is challenging in terms of those molecular pathways and some of those, the broader picture in humans, as you and I have spoken about before, is that, in a lot of cases, time restricted eating reduces calorie intake and weight loss then occurs over time. And that, I think, is the biggest lever that time restricted eating is doing in humans. Like I said, there's a couple of other features in terms of blood pressure and glycemic control that are probably present as well. But the idea that somehow the fat is melting off the body, I think that's kind of being pulled from the rodent literature. And like I said, they're different rates of metabolism. That's why that consequently does happen. So again, and I'm sure we'll get to this, some of the interpretation of what can happen with athletes and performance when it's taken from rodent models is probably a little bit off in terms of what really happens in practice as well. So, it's a bigger picture story really about the translation of rodents to humans.
Yeah, so maybe that does lead us on to the whole, the practical application of it. I suppose there's so many different elements to it. It's hard to go, okay, to talk about it in this context and it in this context. But what are the, let's say from if we are to look at both elements or both sides to it, what can we say are the practical advantages or the potential advantages? And then let's talk about the limitations of it, and maybe again, where this information and where this type of approach can be not just misleading, but just not the right type of direction for somebody to take their habits with food in.
Okay, and you jump in if I'm taking this off in the wrong direction here. So, well, we published a paper just this summer on intermittent fasting in endurance athletes. So I'll tell you a little bit about that, but I'll get to there by telling you the background to it. So the in the animal literature, again, there's a couple of papers that have looked at endurance outcomes in these rodents when they've been put under time restricted eating protocols. And these couple that are there, they seem to show enhancements of mitochondrial function in muscle. They obviously show a decline in body mass. They show an ability to better exercise using fat as a fuel source, for example. So those are favorable things if they could be translated into humans. And the question is, do they do those things actually occur in humans under the types of conditions that we can put people under. So, okay, there's promise there, and obviously a lot of people talk about intermittent fasting on the basis of those rodent studies. Of the work that's been done in athletes, in humans, there's only a handful of studies. I think, if I'm not mistaken, our study was the sixth study, and the previous 5 had focused on resistance training. And in those, there is one study in particular where they do show an enhanced amount of fat loss compared to the control group, even though calories were the same. And that's a pretty interesting finding. But in our study anyway, we followed endurance athletes for 8 weeks just doing their habitual training. And we had one group who were practicing 16-8 time restricted eating, and we had another group who were consuming their control diet. So the control diet, their habitual diet. So the control group didn't change over the course of the 8 weeks. And in the time restricted eating group, what we saw was that they decreased their energy intake significantly within the first 4 weeks, a few hundred calories on average per day. And then by the end of the 8 weeks, that was trending back up again. But the net effect was that they lost body mass over the course of the 8-week period. So the only advice they were given was to eat for 8 hours a day, and they could choose whenever they wanted. And it could be around training, or they could train fast, or whatever the case may be. And we were simply, it was the first study, we were just looking at the broad outcomes. But we also measured a range of markers in endurance, markers of endurance performance as well. So basically treadmill tests, looking at lactate threshold and VO2 max, maximum oxygen uptake. And none of those were changed. So, in purely practical terms, what happened? Well, they practiced 16-8. They adhered to it. The adherence was really good with the protocol. Calorie intake declined initially, tended to go back up towards the end, back up to baseline. But the net effect was that they lost body weight. The majority of this was in, I wouldn't say the majority. It was 50-50 in terms of fat loss and muscle loss. And, we certainly don't want muscle loss. So maybe there's a tweak or two that's needed to the protocol, increased protein intake, for example. But so, going back to your question about what is the practical outcome and what's known in athletes, to my mind, that's all that's known in endurance athletes. There's a lot of promising stuff in rodents, which has questionable translation, I would say, into humans. And of the study that we've done anyway, there's certainly weight loss, as would be expected, by a reduction in calories, but that didn't translate into any performance benefits, at least what we could see in the lab. So that's what we know so far, but obviously I'd say that opens up a lot of questions for to be answered in future.
Yeah, it answers up an awful lot of questions, and I think that very often that this is what the problem is. So one of the things that you mentioned that was found in one of the studies was an increase in calorie expenditure, or an increase in fat loss, even with calories being controlled. Anything in that you could draw out of it, or make any kind of discussion points around?
This is what as you and I've discussed many times before, and I would say the same about our research. When you do a study like this, you're recording food diaries, and you're recording energy expenditure, to training logs or activity monitors and different things like that. And there's always a certain amount of error, and there's error even in the measurement of fat mass. And so, unless you see quite clear changes over several studies, a repeatable finding, then you kind of would always say this is preliminary and let's wait and see. And it's difficult to say what the mechanism would be if you go on the assumption that calorie intake was the same and energy expenditure was the same. Then you're speculating that it's something to do with uncoupling or thermogenesis or some other mechanism that, in fairness, it has been observed in rodents, but those are things we don't measure routinely in humans, so it's impossible to say. It's just speculation then in terms of what would happen. So yeah, unanswered question at the moment.
Can I draw out the trend that you saw in calories creeping back up, and the question marks then about sustainability?
Yeah, well, anytime anyone starts some kind of an intervention, as you again well know, they adhere very well at the start. Now we have no indication in terms of the food diaries and the logs that they stopped or changed their behaviors around the 8-hour window. But in terms of the food diaries that they then recorded, which obviously did include the 8-hour window, they did have this trend to go back up. So what I mean, if I'm thinking practical terms, what happened is they probably initially started off the 8-week intervention, and in those first 4 weeks they were getting used to the idea of, well, this is my new timing, and maybe it turned out that they were cutting out a meal because of the fact that they were only eating in that 8-hour window. And then as they moved towards the end of the 8 weeks, they're probably now bringing that meal back in and eating their meals closer together so that their calories are drifting back up again. So I would say that that's a likely thing to happen. But again, that was observed in another study as well in human active adults. So, the next study I would certainly like to do is extend out for longer than 8 weeks, out to 12, out to 16 weeks, larger population, more frequently measured changes in body composition and food records and so on, and just get a better picture in terms of the information than what we have so far.
I think it's a nice reference because it's a really good example of where people can say, oh, well, it works. Like, intermittent fasting works, but it's like anything that you approach, you're approaching your diet with a new change. It could be that you're cutting out the half a packet of bickies in the evening with your cup of tea. People don't realize it's 300 or 400 calories coming in and on top of their dinner in the evening, and it's something that, like you said, that's new and novel, and that you're adhering to. So that's probably one of the things when I'm speaking to people. I talk about adherence and I talk about your general habits, and are they well formed? Are your habits well formed enough for you to be trying to implement something like this? Can I ask you again? You made a reference to body composition and loss of lean mass. So I appreciate that there is the potential to lose fat mass. Why do you think that you saw that kind of loss in lean mass with the intervention?
Yeah, I think what's first important to say, which I didn't say, is that these were all males that we did and that we measured. And so you're bringing up one of the two cautionary notes that we wrote in the paper. One was that no athlete wants to lose lean tissue mass. Well, most athletes don't. There might be someone who's trying to make weight or drop a weight category or something, and they over a period of time may try and drop some lean mass. But generally speaking, over a 4 to 8 week window, no one wants to drop lean mass. So obviously, if that was again reproduced in many studies, you might not say this is a good approach. The alternative, of course, would be that you can mitigate that perhaps by using things like a higher protein intake within the intermittent fasting window. So there are probably ways to get around that. But once there's a calorie deficit and once there's weight loss occurring, there's always a certain proportion of that will be in the form of lean mass, unless you really elevate protein. The studies are typically saying over 2 grams per kg of body mass per day of protein in order to mitigate lean tissue mass loss. And ours were in around the 1.5, 1.6 grams per kg intake. So they were obviously a little bit below that. And then the other side of things, obviously, is that if an athlete was undertaking intermittent fasting because they were interested in the topic and maybe they wanted to put some structure on their day, or they felt it might work well for them, for example, but weight loss wasn't their intention, and then this obviously wouldn't be a good strategy if it did produce weight loss, or if it created, particularly in endurance athletes, low energy availability. And one of the things that we did see is that on the macronutrient level, the macronutrient that explained the decline in energy intake was carbohydrate. So you now have the situation where you've also got a low carbohydrate intake, which again could be desirable in certain contexts, but probably isn't desirable in the long run. Again, thinking of energy availability and also perhaps thinking of females if we went into that cohort with such a study. So, again, it's one study. I'm making a lot of speculations on the back of that, but there's some of, I think, the more interesting questions that are coming out of this type of research.
Yeah, I think it's really good to have a reference point, and I know from any research that I've participated in myself, or research that I would have undertaken through what different things that are going on with my work in elite sport, it definitely narrows your focus, and it like you said, it often raises a lot more questions, but you start to know what to look out for. I want to just because I think one of the strengths of our relationship is the practical side of it, and sorry, the practical side of our conversation, the practical side of our friendship, but the practical side of having the opportunity to experience these things. So what's your personal experience and your personal application of intermittent fasting?
As in, as a practitioner, or as using it myself?
No, you firstly, I suppose, using it yourself.
Well, I've tried in both ways. The idea of the early time restricted eating and the late time restricted eating, and generally what I find is that as you and I have discussed again, people might be, of course, will be new to hear this, but I don't get the same appetite cues as a lot of other people. So, when some people say they're hungry by under a different protocol, I generally don't experience that. So neither protocol really I found very difficult. They were both relatively easy to me, and I can't say that I noticed any particular difference. But I wasn't at the same time measuring it. It was more for the experience, so I could then talk to people if they asked me about what's it like to do and what are some of the challenges that you face. But most people would say that it's easier to skip breakfast than it is to eat an early dinner and not snack at night. And so, like, if you're doing a 16-8 approach and you're having an early dinner, which is like 5-6 o'clock, and you're not eating for the rest of the evening, but your whole life has been kind of watching TV or say training in the evening and then eating late at night, it is quite a shift for people to do. And again, it may not be practical for people who train in the evening time to have their last meal of the day at 5 or 6 o'clock, even though they've trained at 7 or 8 o'clock, and then can't eat after that. That would be not optimal, obviously. So one thing though that I did know, which I should have said about what could have happened in the study that we published, is that there's always these compensatory behaviours that occur when someone undertakes a change in behaviour, and one of them certainly for me is that I began to eat a little bit more at each of the meals. So like if I had skipped breakfast or delayed breakfast, that first meal tended to be larger than it normally would be, and similarly if I knew it was my last meal of the day as a dinner meal, I tended to eat a bit more there as well. So over time I think everything kind of just balances out. But that's not to dismiss, the potential benefits. Like I said, for someone perhaps not an athlete, but someone who's overweight or obese, it does seem that even independent of weight loss, so if they still consume the same calories and foods, there might be still some benefit. So again, difference between athletes and overweight or obese really matters in these contexts.
I'll give you, I can't stop thinking about you talking about your hunger cues, because I remember one time I was on holidays with Brendan, and we were away.
In Stockholm.
I can't stop laughing about because Brendan and I headed out for the day doing a bit of shopping. Brendan is very much into his style and knew all of the nice shops around Stockholm. And from my perspective, we had a very, very light breakfast, and we'd been on our feet for quite a number of hours at this point, and I was ravenous. And I kept saying, like, when are we actually going to get some food? And Brendan was turned around, was like, what do you mean? Like, we had our breakfast, we'll get it wherever. It wasn't on his mind at all. And I remember like turning around at one stage and I'm just going, what is wrong with you? And you just get on with it. Yeah. But it is such a good example of how, two different people, two different circumstances. I have a set of behaviors that I'm used to. That's whatever those behaviors are. And I respond hormonally very different to you. You could go for 2 days without eating, and there wouldn't be that much change in your personality. Whereas I would turn into a different person. You talk about that kind of change. So I just think it's interesting.
Do you remember what you ended up buying that day?
Yeah, I think it was a big bag of.
What was it?
No, it was a big bag of nuts.
A big bag of nuts.
And here's the thing:
nuts on camera for your followers. You're a very loud chew. That's another thing that really bothers me.
That's why I covered my mouth as you said that. I think it brings up another really, really good point. And you talked about compensatory behaviors. I would find, and this is something that when I'm working with athletes, clients, whatever it might be, I talk about this compensatory behavior effect. And it's leading us in a different direction with our conversation, but I would find that I would seek out those higher calorie foods. I would seek, and that's why even the draw to nuts, like salted nuts, and I've eaten, I may have been in a calorie deficit through all of my walking, but I wasn't long turning that around with 150 grams of salted cashew nuts.
Well, it's hard though, I suppose, to separate when as a nutritionist, when you know about the components of food and so on, it's sometimes hard to separate appetite cues from knowing that your body's burned this energy and you need, we maybe won't get into the detail of how we both think in those ways, but it can be very different, I think, for different people. Again, whether they know about food or know about energy demand and so on and so forth. But yeah, there's no doubt that the behaviours do change. And certainly in response to any change in diet, whether it's more protein at breakfast or whether it's changes around better hydration or like this intermittent fasting that we're talking about, things do change. So the point about practice, though, I even like to hear what you're doing at the moment when people ask you about putting it into practice. I would consider it a tool that can be used for weight loss in short periods of time. So, a 4-week block, and advise someone to, cut out snacking in the evening or, delay breakfast, work. And maybe what done with an athlete in the pre-season, for example, or a mid-season block where they've got some, they're not performing less, and they might want to just improve a bit of body composition. And I think, again, dealing with clients who, when you look at a food diary or when you just talk to them, and it's clear that they're consuming a lot of calories in the evening. It's a very quick fix without, they need. One of the things that's often said is that intermittent fasting requires very little nutrition knowledge. There's no attempt to eat the dietary guidelines, no real talk of macronutrients or micronutrients. It's just simply change the span or the window of when you eat. And I think that's why practically it's very valuable. I think that's why there's such interest in it from a health promotion point of view, is because it's so easy to implement. So that's I think how it could be used.
I suppose our if I just go right back to where we started on this, and in terms of the where we frame the context of anything, I always start with the 12-hour rule that you mentioned. So if you can get somebody to commit to 12 hours, well, the chances of them doing that in 6 months or 12 months time is far higher than if they're committing to 16/8 from the starting point. So that's probably where I would start, and I would say, well, here are the advantages. Like you said, you could apply this for a period of weeks, like you said, but what are you going to be doing in the long term? And that's what I'm focused on. But I do think if I was to say, where would I use it as a tool, or where could somebody use it as a tool? I use the example very often of huge overconsumption of calories. And that's my tool. So if I have, it's not happening obviously at the moment, but when I'm meeting friends over, it could be weddings, it could be events, it could be parties, it could be social events where I've definitely massively overconsumed calories on a given evening, then certainly it could be an advantage to push your calories, or to push your consumption of food out to even 2 o'clock the next day. So it's about, when did you sleep? What this rush to eat first thing in the morning, if you've had a very large late evening meal, maybe a little bit unnecessary.
Yeah, I fully agree. Yeah.
So I suppose if we were to just, if you could give us maybe a summary of the science, and then maybe a quick summary from a practical point of view, pros and cons.
Okay, summary to science would be that there's a lot of very positive findings in rodent models, preclinical models, on the health side in particular, less evidence on the performance side. But then translating that into humans, again, a lot of good evidence at the moment for intermittent fasting having benefits in overweight and obese individuals. A lot of that is to do with weight loss, but there's some of it that is independent of weight loss. So it's definitely a promising tool from that point of view.
Yeah, and then just I suppose the practical element of it, I suppose it not being this what's the best phrase I can use, this cure all, this answer to all our problems.
Yeah, it's not a silver bullet. Yeah, so
silver bullet.
From a practical point of view, so if we think about athletes, it may have some advantages at the moment. It doesn't look that it offers a performance advantage necessarily, but in our work and in the other work that was done in resistance training, strength training, there does seem to be some weight loss benefits if that's what the desired outcome is. So potentially useful there. And But, again, in practical terms, a lot would depend on the phase of the season. A lot would depend on the body composition of the individual. Maybe very lean people already will drive no extra benefit. Maybe it works better in overweight or heavier individuals. So there's a few, look, practically speaking, there's an awful lot of unanswered questions, I think. And again, as you and I often say, it is just a tool that can be used at, in a periodized plan or across the season, again, depending on the individual.
Brendan, I hope we have lots more conversations like this. I feel like we could go in any different direction off some of the things that we've talked about, but I've certainly enjoyed catching up and having a good conversation. I think people will find good value in it. I think there's a lot of really good references, both from a scientific and a practical point of view. So thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.